So we continue this 3-week teaching series today titled, Who Are You? Who are you? It's a look at me, this new pastor of New Hope, and you get to understand who I am a little bit. You get to hear some stories from my past, and in a very small sense, get to know me as I am the new pastor here. But more importantly, more powerfully, we, you and I, and all who believe, get to see who we are in the shadow of Jesus Christ. Get to see who we are and what our identity is, not in our work or who we're married to or how many kids we have, but see what our identity is in Christ Jesus. Last week, as we kicked off the series, I shared with you that I am redeemed. I'm redeemed. But not just me. You are redeemed. All who believe are redeemed. And we're redeemed by this God who loves us so fiercely, so passionately, so over the top, that no matter what unexplainable, sinful, crazy stuff we do, God doesn't stop loving us. Well, today, it's not that we are redeemed. Today we are called. I am called. And you are called. We are called to be Christ's ambassadors, disciples of Jesus. And I'll tell you, for me at least, that is a crazy calling. It is a crazy, awesome, powerful, humbling calling. I think for most of us, myself included, it's also really intimidating. I think a fair share of us start to say things like this. Am I really equipped? Am I really ready to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and to work with him in an ever-expanding kingdom? Am I equipped to do that? Am I worthy of such a calling? I think more than a few of us have those doubts of, am I adequately prepared? Maybe I'm unworthy to be a co-worker with Christ, to walk alongside of people as they search for a hope or a love or a salvation that they cannot find in this world, but is beyond this world. Now, I'll be honest with you. Even as a pastor, I stand here and I live my life as a father and a husband and a pastor, and I've had all of those doubts and all of those questions, a time or two or 10,000 in my life. Am I really called to be a disciple of Jesus? I can remember one of the first times that I had those feelings. I was a freshman in high school. And the church that I grew up in, I showed you an exterior picture last week. Here's an interior picture of that church with all of its red pews. I love that place. And just to the right of that screen that you see in the picture is the pulpit. That was a special place for me. Heard a lot of great sermons from that pulpit. And our church, that church, had a tradition, much like New Hope does, to have youth Sundays. And the high schoolers that wanted to participate could help with worship. They would be the ushers or the greeters, or they could be the readers of the scripture lessons. They could do some of the responsive sentences back and forth. They were allowed to help. And yet never had I seen a student do the sermon until I was a freshman in high school. And by some crazy stroke of God leading him to do it, my pastor asked me to give the message. I didn't have to write it. That's probably a good thing. He wrote it for me and gave it to me in manuscript form. And he said, Chris, read over it, study it, learn it, be able to present it like I would. Talk about a feeling of inadequacy. Talk about being intimidated. I mean, here I was going to stand in front of hundreds of people that had known me since I was in diapers. I was going to proclaim the gospel in sermon form to my Sunday school teachers and former Sunday school teachers and all the people that had helped me with Vacation Bible School and made red Kool-Aid for me and given me Oreos every day. I was going to preach in front of people who knew me before I could use scissors or had heard all of my silly stories in middle school or had bought all my fundraiser stuff for baseball or youth group. I was intimidated. I felt inadequate and incapable of doing what I was asked to do. And I think that's how Jesus operates a lot. I think he calls people in that place and with that mindset and with that struggle. If we look at the scriptures, Matthew chapter 9 gives us Matthew's call. And it's similar to the other disciples, so it's the only one we're going to look at. But we see how Jesus calls his disciple. Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Pretty simple, right? For a pretty simple guy. Follow me. And he rose and followed him. And that's how Jesus does it. But I think more important than how he does it is the why. The what for. And the scriptures show us that too. In the same book, in the same chapter, in the scriptures, we see the why. Beginning at verse 35 of chapter 9, it says this, and Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he, that is Jesus, said to the disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. In that recording of Jesus' words, we see his heart, his compassion, and it is broken for what he sees around him. He sees the hurt and the struggle. He sees the healings that have to take place and the teachings that have to be given. He knows the work that's in front of him, and so he calls disciples. Even from the tax booth, he calls disciples. And they gather around him, these 12 first disciples, and he gives them a job. He gives them their first task. And the first task isn't to read the orientation manual. It's not to fill out your I-9 or your W-2 or to fill out any of those papers. The first job that he gives them is to pray. And to specifically pray for more workers, more disciples. More you and more me. More people to share Jesus. And looking at the first 12 in the scriptures, if we look at their qualifications and their background and we call their references, we're going to find that they're nothing to write home about. They are not the sharpest knife in the kitchen drawer. But Jesus calls them anyway. He calls them to walk alongside of him, to share the gospel. He calls them to cast out demons and to heal the sick. And not ever did Jesus lose sleep over their qualifications. Jesus never wasted any time looking through their application and calling their references to get a good feel for who they were. He just called them. And when we hear that and we think about that and we apply it in our own lives, it doesn't make sense. We probably think Jesus should have used the human resource department. We think that he should have called the men who had experience or the ones who had untapped potential or the ones who had some powerful spiritual insights. But the scriptures don't tell us any of that. As he calls the 12, they are as ordinary and plain as that high school kid asked to preach a sermon at his home church. At best. And at worst, these disciples and that kid were flawed and overmatched. But he calls them anyway. And I would say that event and that calling in the disciples' life and in my life says more about Jesus' nature than it does our qualifications. It says that Jesus is welcoming. It says that he's always inviting. It says that he's always accepting. He's always wanting. He's always loving. It says all of that way more than it says anything about our qualifications. I mean, if we take a step back and think about the call to be disciples of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 4, he calls fishermen at the local fishing spot. And he calls a tax collector out of the tax booth. If we look at our own lives, he calls farmers and welders. He calls factory workers. He calls students and senior citizens. He calls lawyers and accountants and teachers and doctors. And he calls you and he calls me. There's not a hint of being qualified in any of it. In fact, if we really look at it, it's that we are all disqualified. Matthew, we don't need to cover for him. He's a scoundrel of a tax collector stealing money from people. And Peter, another of the disciples, is bold and brash in his denial of Jesus and association with him. And Thomas is like an Eeyore kind of doubter in the power of Jesus' resurrection. And Judas, one of the 12, was so selfish and money hungry that he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And that's just the ones that the scriptures write about. But I would argue vehemently that all of the other 8 original disciples and the disciples sitting in front of me and standing in front of you have our own special brand of sin too. But we're called. And it seems as though the gospel bends over backwards to make it plain and clear that we are not qualified, but we are put to use anyway. And God sends us out to transform the world with the power of God's forgiving love. We're called to transform the world, to do the same work that Jesus was doing all along, to change the trajectory of mankind. Before Jesus came as a babe swaddled in clothes, the trajectory was downhill. Death and dying and decay. And when that Christ child comes along, it's life and joy and peace on earth and life everlasting. And it's the work that Jesus is doing to transform the world. He transformed the woman caught in adultery. He loved her. Laying there on the ground, ready to be stoned. He loved her when everyone else wanted to punish her. And Jairus' daughter in the New Testament and Lazarus, he changed their trajectory from dead corpse to living, breathing evangelists. When everyone else wanted to laugh at Jesus or to say that the corpse would just be smelly, Jesus raises them from the dead. And for the man born blind, he gives sight where it had never been before, and the list goes on and on and on in the transforming work of Jesus Christ in their lives and in our lives. And he gives us that work, that calling, that responsibility. He takes the ordinary and the flawed, and he sets them as a beacon of light in a dark world. When I got that responsibility as a high school kid, I didn't feel adequate. I didn't feel prepared. I didn't feel capable at all. But I was willing. Maybe I was a bit naive, but I was willing. And God can do a lot with willing. I think that's a characteristic of God that so often goes overlooked. That God sees way more in us than we see in ourselves. God sees more in us than we see staring back at us in the mirror. That God, I'll be honest, sees more in you than I see in you standing right here. Because God knows you and loves you and calls you. And now, God also knows the world that He created, and He knows its needs, and He knows that you've all picked up a bit of wisdom along the way that can meet those needs. And God knows that He can take your experiences of leading a family, or working where you work, or being in the relationships you've been in, or going to the schools that you've gone to. He can take all of those experiences and He can mold them and shape them and multiply them in ways that we could never do. And He promises in all of this, in this great calling that we have, He promises to equip and to sustain and to lead us every step of the way. As a scared freshman in high school, I stood in that pulpit and I didn't know how I would get through that message. But God equipped me and sustained me and led me every step of the way, every word that was spoken, and He's continued to do it to this very day. The promise came to the forefront of my mind at the end of that worship service way back in high school. Our church had a tradition, still has a tradition, that the pastor would line up at the outside of the worship space, outside of the sanctuary. That sanctuary is much more narrow and longer than this one is, and there's 3 doors, and all of those doors funnel into one exit point. The pastor would stand there, and I can remember as a kid going up and giving him a high five or a hug or shaking his hand. Well, on that Sunday that the high school youth led worship, we got an opportunity to stand in that same spot as the pastor. And people would come along and they would shake our hands, or they would give us an attaboy, or they would pinch our cheeks and say, "Good job," generally saying very kind things to us, except one woman. One smallish, elderly woman. She came through the line, and I was at the end of the line, and she put out her right hand, and I took it in my right hand, and she used her left hand, and she put it on my right forearm, and she was holding me, and she looked me in the eyes, deep into my soul, and she said, "Chris," she knew my name, "Chris, I didn't hear you up there today. I heard God speaking through you." I can't tell you how impactful that woman was on my life. I can't tell you how she was used by God to change the trajectory of my life. I wanted to be a fireman growing up. Really wanted to be a baseball player, but I knew I wasn't good enough to do that. So fireman was the next best thing. It's what my best friend's dad was. And I saw him and respected him and loved him, so I wanted to be a fireman. Until I heard her words. And she planted that seed in my heart. That God had a calling on my life. What's mysterious or miraculous is I didn't know that woman. If you were here last week, you heard me say that church is my home church. It's the only church I've ever been a member at, unless I was a pastor on staff. I grew up there, baptized, confirmed, married. My oldest son was baptized there. It is my home church. I still have relation there, and my in-laws attend there. I knew everyone, and everyone knew Chris Decker. But I didn't know that woman. As we were driving home, my mom and I from church that day, I told her what this woman had said. I told her that she was wearing these clothes, and she had this skin color, and she had this color hair. I described her as best I could. And my mom didn't know who that woman was. What I didn't tell you last week is that my mom grew up in that church. She was baptized and confirmed there. Everyone knew her, and she knew everyone except that woman. So we get home that morning, and we pull out the old church pictorial directory that's always too old, right, when it's published. But we pulled it out, and we started looking through all the pictures, scouring and searching for this woman, and we never found her. I will leave it to you to draw your own conclusion on who that woman was. I stopped doing that and trying to figure it out a long time ago. Now I think about that woman, and I thank God for her. I thank God that she lit a fire in a high school kid to do ministry and to share Jesus. When I think about her, I am reminded that as flawed as I am, as overmatched as I am sometimes, I'm called. And you are called. We are called. Despite our inadequacies in our attributes and characteristics and personalities, with a lack of courage and a lack of talent, we are called to be disciples of Jesus. And he promises us his presence. He promises to be with us every step of the way. We won't get it right every time. The disciples clearly did not get it right every time. And that high school kid preaching a message at his home church. He didn't get it right every time. And I'm not going to get it right every time. But God uses us each and every time. I pray that as you answer that call, that God wouldn't see you or that people wouldn't see you. They wouldn't hear you, but they would hear and see God in you.